Welcome to Therapist Confidential, a psychotherapy.net podcast. And now, here's your host, Travis Heath.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Therapist Confidential podcast. I'm your host, Travis Heath, and today I'm flying solo with you to talk about speaking about the unspeakable in therapy. So we're going to speak about the unspeakable on the podcast. Let me give you a little history here, kind of where this idea is, where the genesis of this idea is for me. I would say, I lose track of time. Maybe 12 to 15 years ago, I started really cueing into uh, people speaking about death. And in this case, these folks were caregivers for people who were dying. And I noticed that, if you've done this kind of work, as a therapist, or if you're listening to this and even you're not a therapist, I bet you've had this happen where you're speaking with someone and you can tell that they're not saying something, right? You just have a felt sense of it. Maybe you can see it on their face. Maybe you can hear it in the words, like the tone of the words, but something's not being said. And I don't remember exactly how I would get here with people, but I remember that they would express relief that someone was near death or had actually died in their life. And they would express this relief, and it would be followed by this avalanche of shame. And I started to notice that this was a pattern that would come up, right? When people were caretakers or someone close to them was dying, where they would feel relief, but they would feel they cannot express it, but they would express it to me. And then it would be followed by this like distancing shame response. And at first, I just sort of didn't quite know what was happening, and I just let that go. As time has gone past, I've sort of paused it when that happens, and I've asked people to lean in and speak about that feeling of relief, the speaking of the unspeakable, right? So I kind of stumbled upon this through years of doing this work almost accidentally, just by sort of slowly paying attention. Maybe other people would have caught on faster, but it took me a number of years to do that. I'll give you one other example. I've noticed that, and this has happened especially with mothers. And if we think about kind of societal stories, it makes a lot of sense that this would be mothers saying this, right? And societal mandates about how mothers can be and how mothers can't be. But there would be times where I'm talking to a mother and she expresses just complete overwhelm. Anyone who's a parent can relate to that. And I imagine mothers listening can relate to that, right? But then, they would sort of say sometimes almost without thinking that they could imagine a world where they didn't have kids, right? Or gosh, what if I just didn't have, I could travel the world, I'd have all this free time to exercise, engage in hobbies, be in a romantic relationship in the way that I want to be. Gosh, I could imagine this world without kids. Now, of course, what they're clearly not saying is, I don't love my kids, right? But even the mention of an alternative dimension someplace where they didn't have kids, an alternative script for their life, brings so much shame. And again, I was slow to the party with this one too, but over time I've learned to kind of lean into that and explore it with people and speak about what is unspeakable. And in this case, the society says that if you're a mother, right, you have to love being a mother all the time. And oh my gosh, not only do you have to love being a mother, but if you for a moment get so overwhelmed that you even conceive of a universe where you didn't have kids, oh boy. I mean, now the judgment comes down harshly, right? Now, what actually inspired this particular episode for me, and it's been a few months in the making, I've kind of let some things unfold in my own therapy practice before wanting to bring it here to the podcast. But it was when Charlie Kirk was shot. If you don't know Charlie Kirk, he was a right-wing podcaster, activist, right? who was shot while on stage in Utah. I'm assuming most people probably know, but I'm just giving that context in case you don't. And what I noticed, not surprisingly, right, the people that I'm working with in the therapy room, most, if not all of them, wanted, or I don't know if wanted's the right word, but they spoke about this in some way in their conversations with me. And it people are different. They're situated differently, sociopolitically, socioculturally in the world, right? So the ways in which the conversation would come up were a bit different, but it was clear this was on everyone's mind. And the conversation would usually start something like, "Oh my gosh, can you believe that happened?" Just kind of, "Oh," and then there was this kind of grotesque video where you could actually see him getting shot online, right? And so people were traumatized. I mean, I look, I don't like to overuse that word, but I think they were traumatized watching that video. And so it came up in sessions, right? Well, I've been doing this 20 or so years and I've learned a few things along the way. And so as they just brought it up generally, I would sort of ask a little bit more about their relationship with what they were seeing, what they were feeling with regard to Charlie Kirk being shot. And as I did that, I discovered, ooh, there's a lot that's unspeakable here, right? I'll get into some of what I heard, that was unspeakable, that then became spoken. And then we'll talk some about, was there any, per the people I work with, was there any value in speaking about the unspeakable? So this isn't inherently a party political episode, but I won't say it's not a political episode. That would be ridiculous because the very act of psychotherapy is a political act. It's not necessarily a party political act, but is a political act. It's not a neutral act. We have positions in doing this work. And even if we claim neutrality, that in itself is a position, but that's for another episode. So this isn't explicitly about politics, or it's not explicitly about deciding who is right or wrong. It's more about how do we invite people we're working with to speak about the unspeakable? What rises inside of people after a polarizing tragedy? What are the emotions we're not supposed to have by society's sometimes unspoken, often unspoken rules and edicts? And perhaps therapy can be one of the few places where we can actually talk about this. In the example with Charlie Kirk, people were feeling everything: grief, fear, shame, as I mentioned, confusion, numbness, and yes, sometimes relief, and sometimes righteous anger about what had occurred on both of the sort of standard political sides in the United States, the right wing and the left wing, right? Both had righteous anger. And just to be transparent, in my practice, I work with folks all over the political spectrum. So I felt that righteous anger manifesting in different ways based on the political affiliations people had, which was interesting. So when I think about speaking the unspeakable, therapy to me really isn't about sorting emotions or experiences into acceptable and unacceptable. The world does plenty of that. I don't really view therapy as a place for doing that. I view therapy more as a place to ask about, what does each feeling mean? Where is it coming from? What are the stories that these feelings are rooted in? And, it's worth noting that just speaking for myself, having this conversation as a therapist versus having it as a friend or an acquaintance or a colleague in the world, these are all different. Now, I'd like to believe that I show up relatively similarly across these different contexts of living, right? That if you know me on the podcast and you know me in the world and you know me at the university as a therapist, that you would see some consistencies that exist there. right? I hope so anyway. I mean, I won't make the claim I'm exactly the same person across all contexts, right? That would be a bold claim. But I'd like to think that you'd see some consistencies. However, as a therapist, I have different responsibilities in these kinds of conversations than I do with a friend or a colleague in the world, right? As a therapist, my job is to lean into the experience of the other, to try to understand their knowledges, their stories. It's not so much to sort of rant about my opinions in the world. Now, this doesn't mean I don't have opinions, and it doesn't mean I'm behaving neutrally as a therapist. I'm not. But it means that I have more responsibility than I do when talking to a friend, right? When talking to a friend, I can just kind of rant about whatever I want to rant about. As a therapist, I'm not sure that would be so useful, right? So while I think I may show up in ways that are very similar across contexts, I have a different responsibility as a therapist. So, in speaking the unspeakable, there are certainly feelings our culture doesn't give us permission to have. So, in the example of what happened with Charlie Kirk, relief that someone that we saw as harmful is gone or has been killed in this instance, right? I was working with people that express relief around this and often followed that with shame, uh, almost um, almost a certain it was like people use the word unbelievable all the time, but for some people it almost felt unbelievable to them that they felt relief, right? And that relief, I want to say, like, this is very different than someone saying, because as a therapist we have certain obligations in the world, right? So this is very different than someone saying, hey, I'm going to go murder such and such public figure or even just murder someone in the world, right? That's not how these conversations were going. It was like, gosh, I felt he was saying really harmful things in the world, and I actually feel this sense of relief that he's gone. Now, people didn't just come out and say that, right? I'll give you some of the questions I was asking people earlier, if those might be of use to people exploring these kinds of topics. But where we got was to this place of, gosh, I feel relief around this because I feel like some of what he was saying was very dangerous. And then I had other people that felt devastated. They felt like they were under attack. They were, and not necessarily under attack like they were going to be shot. No one said that, but they felt like sort of their ideas and their ways of being in the world were under attack. Right. Now, in therapy, I think we can say, bring that here. We can say that in lots of different ways. I tend to do it through questions, but we can say this is a space to discuss that. And let's try and understand what you're feeling together. And it's a sense of curiosity and understanding that I'm after, right? It's honoring, hopefully, a sense of honesty within that. It's not about endorsing harm, right? So rather than when somebody says, you know what, I feel relief that Charlie Kirk has been killed. What I do when I hear that is lean in with curiosity to try to understand. I don't judge that, right? Or when somebody says, you know, I'm a huge Charlie Kirk supporter and everything that he believes, and this was devastating to me. In both of those instances, I want to know why, right? Not why, like in an interrogative stance, like why, but why? Help me understand. I want to understand what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, what's going on for you. And when we can do that, perhaps we begin to start speaking the unspeakable. Now, to do this, we have to tend to complexity and nuance. I don't know how we can have conversations like this without attending to complexity and nuance. Political polarization, really polarization of any kind, but in this case, political polarization tends to try and flatten people. That's been my observation. It dehumanizes people. It makes them one dimensional, right? So, some of you listening to this might already have read this, but in the Reimagining Narrative Therapy book from, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago at this point, I actually wrote a story um, an autoethnography, but a big word for a story, just an account of me working with a woman who was a Trump supporter. This was way back in what, 2016? But if you're interested in reading how I went about that conversation, you can read it in the book. Shameless plug for the book, I guess. Sorry, not trying to sell books here, but I bring that up just to say this notion that polarization tries to flatten people, right? And I noticed in my conversation with my client, who happened to be a Trump supporter, I'm not a Trump supporter, full disclosure. I noticed that that polarization tried to flatten her. And when I really leaned in and tried to understand where she was coming from with curiosity, right? Then I saw a three-dimensional human being. I saw familial stories. I saw cultural stories that existed, right? And she was no longer flat. Now, that doesn't mean I had to give up my own beliefs about the world. I don't. That doesn't mean I have to be neutral. I don't have to do any of that. In fact, I think leaning in with curiosity is not a neutral act at all. I'll say more about curiosity here momentarily, but I think that requires us to take a position, actually. And, I want to say too that I think contradiction isn't pathology. Contradiction is to be human. We all live in contradiction. It's just a matter of how much we're aware of that contradiction at any given time. Now, certainly there are some contradictions that probably can't exist at the same time, or it's very hard for them to. I understand. But most of us live in various degrees of contradiction, and that is to be human. And again, polarization tries to flatten us, and it tries to create a world where there is no contradiction. I'll share this quick story from a decade or so ago. The only social media I've ever had is Twitter, whatever you call it now, X. And I remember like when Trump first got on office, I was like, I was feeling like, hey, if we could just help people see their own hypocrisy, we'd get ourselves out of this. Surely they'd be disturbed by their own hypocrisy. But here's the issue with that. We're all hypocrites. It's just a matter of in what ways and how much we acknowledge it, right? And so then trying to point out people's hypocrisy to me, maybe other people have a different experience with that, became a fool's errand. Now, I didn't do that in therapy, but just as a citizen of the world, as a person in the world, 10 years ago, I discovered, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I discovered that's probably not, it's not a good use of my time. Let's put it that way, because I'm a hypocrite as well. It's just a matter of in what ways. And then it's a matter of whether we're open to hearing it or not. Right. And so if we enter into a therapeutic conversation that's polarized, that is ultimately flattening people and where there's no room for people to contradict themselves, I don't think we're going to get very far. And if we turn that same lens to ourselves, I think we'll see that we're deeply contradictory people too. Which doesn't mean we don't have any responsibilities around that, around observing our contradictions and seeing how they're functioning in the world. But we're all contradictory, and contradiction in itself isn't pathology. I was mentioning anger earlier, and with what in the aftermath of what happened with Charlie Kirk, there was lots of anger. Some of it felt chaotic, some of it felt very morally grounded. There was anger that was tied to values, anger that was tied to safety, anger that was tied to people's sense of lived experience in the world, right? Now, it's interesting because anger is one of those things that I think therapists have a chance to really lean into with people rather than trying to quiet it. I think anger oftentimes in the world gets quieted. Now, there are certainly exceptions to that. And I think, some of that it's gendered for sure. I mean, I think men are allowed to show up in angrier ways than women in a general sense in the world. So I don't want to say that anger is always quieted, but I think in a general sense, we fear anger and we try to move away from it. And one of the things I was doing in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death, when people were bringing this up, was trying to lean into people's anger and get curious about it. I remember I wrote down some questions that I actually asked. I keep notes, and I'm really interested in questions I'm asking and what the responses to those questions are. At one point, I asked someone, "What value is your anger protecting?" Because it was my sense that there was a really important value to them that their anger was protecting. I won't share how that was responded to. That's to remain confidential, but the question was useful. And in fact, the person remarked on the question being useful. So I thought I'd share it with you. Another question I asked at one point to a different person was, what harm in your story makes this anger understandable? And there were past harms for this person that were brought up, right, by Charlie Kirk's death. And this happens all the time in the world, right? If you're a therapist, you know this, where something happens in the world and it triggers something. I hate using that word triggers these days, but it elicits something in a person, right, that feels close and important to them. Can we gain a better understanding of how anger can recruit us into dehumanization, violence, etc.? you know, not Look, here's what we're pretty good at. We're pretty good at seeing how anger can recruit that person over there, that person that we don't like, that person with different political values or lives on the other side of the tracks. We're pretty good at seeing how anger can recruit them into dehumanization. But here's the thing, we have to look at ourselves because we're human and we too can be recruited into those same ways of behaving. And for us to think that we're somehow above that, any of us, I don't just mean us as therapists, as human beings, when we start thinking we're above dehumanization, we're above violence. We would never act violently, right? And I think that's to misunderstand what any human being might be capable of in certain circumstances, right? And so a question like that, right? When we look at how anger can recruit us into dehumanization or violence, and of course, we could ask the same thing to the people we're working with. That becomes a useful question because then we're reflecting on ourselves and we're not just reflecting on the other, the big bad other. And don't get me wrong, like people have legitimate reasons to be angry at the other. It's just that in the therapeutic context, right? Looking at ourselves and how we too might be recruited into dehumanization has had value in the work that I've done. The other thing is with righteous anger, what people are often saying, and I've learned this from the people I work with, what they're often saying is, I care about justice. I care about the world people live in and maybe have to live in. Right. So when we sit with the anger, what we discover is there's often an important message that lies underneath. It's just we have to stay with the anger to potentially find it. And this sort of anger deserves curiosity. It doesn't deserve shaming. Now, let me say something about curiosity. I think oftentimes curiosity gets thought of in therapy as like this happy, sunny puppy dogs and candy canes and rainbows sort of thing. Oh, curiosity. And it can be that. I also want to propose that curiosity sometimes isn't always gentle. And by that, I don't mean it's aggressive. I don't mean it's harmful, but I mean it isn't always this gentle process. Sometimes curiosity invites us to stay in tension longer than we want to, longer than what feels comfortable to us. And curiosity sometimes reveals things that are hard to hear. Curiosity, it asks us questions like, what earlier wounds or loyalties live beneath the surface? What quieter feelings might be hiding under the loud ones? What deeper, heartfelt stories are the emotions that people are talking about a part of? And so, in this way, to me, curiosity is ethical work. It's not just a cute thing that we do, a happy, cute thing. It's ethical work. It's hard work. It isn't always gentle. Sometimes curiosity is taking us into some dark, uninhabitable, or seemingly uninhabitable places. But the thing about curiosity that I've noticed is it helps keep us human. Certainty tries to make us rigid. Curiosity helps keep us human. And so when we think about curiosity, think about doing that even when it's uncomfortable. We all love to be curious when it's comfortable, me included. Boy, that's a lot of fun to be curious when it feels comfortable. But sometimes where curiosity is most needed is those moments where it's uncomfortable. Here's a few questions, a few additional questions I wrote down. I went back through my notes and got from my work that I've been asking folks, um, around the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death. So one was, when this reaction showed up, what story in your life does it seem to belong to? What experiences in your life make this response understandable? I gave you that one earlier. This is one I did with someone who is a writer and quite creative, and we were having trouble accessing it. So I said, if this reaction were a character, what would it say it's trying to protect? What does this reaction reveal about what matters to you? I'm just saying this reaction because people had different reactions. So I'm just putting this reaction in there. It's whatever the reaction is, right? So, what does this reaction reveal about what matters to you? This reaction, this feeling, right? This experience. How has the political and cultural climate trained us to feel or not feel in moments like this? I ask some variation of that question a lot when diving into these things. How has the political and cultural climate trained us to feel or not feel in moments like this? And I think oftentimes people just assume this feeling belongs to them, it's intrinsic to them. And we've failed to see how our reactions are being shaped by the larger systems and culture, which, by the way, that's not necessarily problematic, right? It's just, it can be useful to know where that's coming from and that it might not be coming organically, intrinsically from us. And then one more question: whose narratives are shaping your response and whose are missing? I really like that question too, right? Because often, especially in this case where we're talking about polarized sort of political violence, it's we're blind, first of all, to the narratives that are often shaping our responses. And in doing so, we're really blind to other potential narratives that could be influencing us that we're not aware of or not considering. So considering systemic context to me in this sort of work is crucial. People's reactions don't come from nowhere. They live inside of systems, they live inside of media, politics, history, identity, power, belonging. We could go on, right? These reactions don't come from nowhere. And these sort of systemic reactions, they teach us who we're allowed to grieve and in what ways, how we're allowed to grieve, who we're allowed to despise, who we're allowed to love, who we're expected to pay attention to, who we're supposed to ignore, right? And again, a lot of times these function just underneath the surface. So people aren't even aware this is going on. So the idea of speaking the unspeakable, all these questions I'm bringing up and these ideas about systems are in the service of trying to speak about the unspeakable. Because if things are so taken for granted that we don't speak about them, that's a great way to keep things unspoken. I think therapy, though, has the potential, it's not guaranteed, but I think therapy has the potential to resist these oversimplifications, right? And then we can start with the people we're working with to tease out what they really feel, believe, etc. And again, my job is not to tell them what to feel or believe. but it's to try to ask them questions, be curious, help them get a better understanding of why they believe what they do, and also maybe what perspectives they're missing. Like I work with a lot of men, and there's this phrase, toxic masculinity. And let me just tell you, years ago when I first heard that, it must be over a decade ago when I first heard that, I was like, ooh, that's a cool term. And I remember I was working with a man who I had a good relationship with who, maybe practiced some forms of what gets labeled as toxic masculinity. And I remember I brought up that term with him and he just shut down. So saying something like, hey, in what ways are you practicing toxic masculinity? Not a great way to invite people, in this case, men, to look at their relationship with masculinity, right? And so a lot of these terms we have, they can be great in terms of describing things. They can philosophize and they can point out a pattern and give it a label. That's fine for that sort of work, but for the work we do, that kind of language isn't so useful, I found. What could be better, at least what I found to be better in the work that I do, is just to begin to ask men about what it means to be a man and how did they learn about being a man and from whom? And are there parts of what they learned about being a man that don't line up with what they actually have come to learn about being a man during their years of living? Are there aspects, if we look beyond what they've been told, that they might want to adopt as part of being a man? Right. And so when we have those kinds of conversations, now the unspoken starts to become spoken. But if we just say something like, why are you engaging in toxic masculinity? We're probably not going to get very far. Right. And so for me, how do we lean in a respectful, dignified way to try and understand people's experience and potentially expand the potential of what their experience of the world could be? It's been my experience that division doesn't actually erase complexity, this kind of political division. It doesn't actually erase complexity. If you pay close attention, it actually exposes it. You see more complexity. I know it sounds like a contradiction, and it probably is in a lot of ways. But what I've noticed is that division, like, yes, at first glance, it seems like division erases complexity. It does flatten people and you think it erases complexity, but it really doesn't. If you pay attention, it exposes it because there's complexity all around. It's just people aren't talking about it. They're not acknowledging it. They're retreating to a binary position, one side of a binary position. Therapy can be one of the rare places where multiple truths sit beside each other and where they're not competing to win. Right? So often in the world, these different truths are competing to be the best truth, right? This is what we see with debates. I used to watch political debates all the time. I was like, oh, yeah, this is all, I thought I was an adult in my 20s, watching these debates. And in my early 30s, I'm 45 now, it started to become less interesting to me. And now I don't watch them at all, if maybe for comedic relief. But other than that, I don't watch them. And the reason I don't is because whoever wins the debate isn't the person with the best ideas necessarily. They're the most persuasive speaker. They have the most charisma. That doesn't mean they have the best ideas. And that doesn't, like, when I think about debate, I think about, sort of old school definitions of debate, going way back to like the ancient Greeks, where a debate was, I'm going to start on my side of that debate and I'm going to go all the way over to your side. I'm going to look at everything in between and you're going to do the same. And in the process, we're going to learn something together. That's not what I see debate as these days. Debate is like two opposing ideas and one of them has to win. And I think in therapy, we don't have to do that. In therapy, it can be, and boy, I've been doing a lot of this beyond just the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk scenario, but where we have multiple truths sitting alongside one another, sometimes contradictory, but we learn to hold them all simultaneously. People can say, I'm angry, I'm scared, I'm relieved, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed, I'm relieved. I don't know how to feel, right? Going back to where I started this episode, talking about death, where people would say, gosh, on one hand, I feel devastated that this person in my life has died. And on the other hand, I feel relieved because I just couldn't do it anymore. Right. I didn't have it in me to keep taking care of them. I had no bandwidth. And then they'll say things like, gosh, does that make me a bad person? Right. Okay. Now we're speaking the unspeakable. And we can lean into those things rather than judging them and rather than answering that rhetorical question of, am I a bad person? We can lean into that question with curiosity. What's underneath it? How have you come to believe that you might be a bad person for having these two feelings simultaneously? So instead of rushing to judge, which is so often what happens in the outside world, we can slow down. We can wonder. Gosh, I do a lot of wondering in therapy. I say I wonder a bunch. And we can listen for the stories that are underneath the feelings. We can ask people, what unspeakable feeling in you might be waiting not to be judged, but finally understood. All right. That's all I got for you this time, everyone. Great speaking with you. I hope your new year is off to a wonderful start. And if you're enjoying these podcasts, whether they're the interviews or these solo episodes, tell a friend, tell two friends, email someone. Is that how you do it these days? Yeah, I feel like an old man. Do you email someone about it? Do you send them a link? I don't know. Put it on your TikTok, do all the things. But if it's of interest to you, please share it. That's the only way we have the opportunity to get the word out. Give us ratings on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and YouTube and all the good things. All right, everyone. I appreciate you. Till next time.